From Tumblr user VaultSV. You have a wound that will never heal? Me too. Actually, it's gradually widening and expanding, consuming more of me with each passing day. At what point do you think I'll become the wound itself and not simply the bearer? This is about pre-algebra. Uh, I've been studying math again because I have to retake the ACT. So, but any conceptual domain that I get into, the tangents that I go off, I immediately go off in tangents into kind of the symbolic realm, I guess is what you would call it. Side note, I keep trying to figure out how to describe what it is that I do and what realm it is that I'm thinking in, and like that is my specialty, but I don't think there's a word for it in common parlance, and that kind of bothers me because I want to explain it, you know. I guess I should just say philosophy, but I like kind of hate that word, but I guess I should just say it because that's the way that people are gonna, someone on the street, so to speak. They don't know what's the symbolic world. And then, of course, you say the symbolic world, and you might think that I'm then kind of more of a, like Pajot or something, where I have a strict theology, and I really don't. So I don't want to be lumped in with them either. So, or maybe just poetic, like poetry, but it's like more rigorous than poetry. It's like the set of underlying symbolic structure from which a poem emerges that I'm really working with. But yeah, I don't have a set phrase for it, and it irritates me because I want a set phrase for it. However, theopoetics is not all theological, but I guess. Metaphysics, that sounds. At any rate, whenever I get into a certain conceptual domain, I will mostly just be drawing analogies from it and using it as a gateway into kind of my primary area of thought, which is in the realm of very, very, very deeply underlying spiritual and like symbolic structures that structure our world. Maybe I should go into higher education, not like to get higher education, but just so that I'll be able to be like, I have a PhD in this, and then people will be like, ooh, instead of, I don't know. Yeah. But I was thinking about remainders, you know, in math. Because you deal with remainders, you know, you do an operation on some numbers, and the numbers in the operation, and there's the neat part, and then you have something that's left over, which is the remainder. But then in scripture, or in traditionally, you have the idea of like the remnant. That's like a sacred remnant in a society, or that's left behind after the destruction of a society, that kind of is the seed for the new world. And you also have, similarly, or what's a parallel to that, and an instance of the same, is that you have the margins. You have excess, and that which does not kind of fit into a system. And so that could be anything from vacation time as opposed to ordinary work time and life, or eccentric people who don't fit into a societal structure, or, you know, disabled people who don't fit into a societal structure, or um, so yeah, you know, margins in a structure or in society. You also have the idea of imperfections, usually imperfections in art, because there's a tradition that, because you want your craft or your art to be perfect, right? And to be made according to the pattern and to be in the order that it should be. Say, if you're making a rug or something. But there are traditions in a lot of cultures where you have a little imperfect stitch, or you leave a little hole in it, or you have to leave some part ritually imperfect so that it won't be too perfect, so that it won't like trap your soul in it. And I'm kind of giving examples of the thing that I'm trying to point at, what all of these have in common. I believe it has to do with like, but well, but that's how my mind goes, is just like when I am thinking about, as soon as I start thinking for a certain amount of time about, let's say, mathematical structures and how they work, and then I start thinking about, oh, you say sometimes you have a remainder left. Oh, but what about the remainder that's left on the excess, on the outer edge of a certain lifestyle or of a certain society, or the remainder that doesn't fit into your worldview, or the remainder of raw physical experience that doesn't fit into any philosophical system, and that isn't captured by your philosophical system. And or the remainder of like enjoyment and just passing time that is in excess of your productive activities. And then I start thinking about that as an instance of excess, which connects it to beauty, which to me is intertwined with pleasure and love as in like becoming one with and being in relation with. And then beauty and excess are connected with death, in the sense of Georges Bataille in Eroticism, Death and Sensuality, Death. So you have this whole structure. And it's so meta, you can honestly get to that place from almost anywhere. Like even this, what I'm doing right now, I spend a lot of time in that kind of space looking for the principles that hold my life together and by which, in my perception, the world works. And that's my kind of central structure. But there's the remainder, or the sacred remnant, with that is the time that I spend just being in the physical world and really not thinking, not trying to figure it out, and taking things as they come and letting experience be what it is without trying to put it through these filters or make it into some sort of instrument for anything else. And that's very necessary, because the remnant is sacred to the whole, in that, and I don't remember what the term is for the part that's not a remainder, quotient or something. See what I mean? It doesn't help me with math, but I'm inspired by it. But anyway, so we have the whole, which is everything, and then you have the remnant and the structure, I guess. But it's sacred to the whole because the remnant, like, it's like it says, like, a little leaven leaveneth the whole. It balances it out, or yeah, it balances it out. And of course, going back to the idea of sacred remnant in like the way that one lives one's life and where one spends one's time and how, there are other people who, might live their day-to-day life very much just in the flow of things. And for them, the sacred remnant might be time of contemplation and a time to step back and look at the big picture and ponder deeply, because that's what would balance them out. But what would balance me out is anything that's not pondering deeply. And so, yeah, the remnant is sacred. Now, I think, at least the one time that I can think that it's used in the Bible, the part about a little leaven, leaveneth the whole, that's used about corruption and like about something bad. A little bit of bad gets into this whole thing that's good, it'll infuse it throughout. But then you certainly could reverse that image, and I don't even know, there might even be another verse that does. But to say that, a little bit of good also can sanctify the whole. And it's the same, is it? Is it the same principle both ways? Because, like, for instance, the idea that without charity it profits nothing, or without love. You could have everything right, everything in order, but if your motives are wrong, worthless. Or you could have kind of be a mess, but if your heart is pure or whatever, you have that kind of coloring of a good maybe intention or heart in it, then it will color everything and it will be all good. But the fact that there's that, but I was using, hold up, because I was using sacred for like, well, no, because the thing is that the sacred isn't morally good inherently or morally bad inherently, and this is another thing that Georges Bataille goes into, and I've kind of been trying to summarize his thesis in my own terms, but it just ends up being worked into whatever else I end up talking about. So eventually I will have sort of a summary of it, but oh, now I'm thinking about, yeah, but the sacred isn't, it's transcendent. It kind of transcends morality. It is um just other, which is why, when things are, especially were, because like Christianity sort of changed stuff and messed with it a little bit, but traditionally if something's taboo and sacred, it's kind of the same, and it's just a different type of morality, a different realm that you basically enter. And that's true, the remainder or remnant is subject to different rules, which I guess is why it can't fit into the hole in the first place. Going back, going back to, mathematical remainders, if you have a certain numbers in a certain operation and they're in one relationship with each other in proportion with each other, dividing neatly or whatever, the remainder is the part that doesn't fit into that operation. Therefore, it is subject to, well, a different set of rules and a different set of relationships, and it's in its own space, kind of left over and in this marginal and liminal space beside the part that does fit into the system. And so, that's the kind of balancing and the kind of renewing quality of it. Because, for instance, in your work life, you're subject to certain rules, certain things you can and can't do, certain priorities. But then when you're on vacation or when you get done with work and you're just relaxing, there's a whole different set of priorities, or usually like a looser set, but also like a different one. You're doing it, you're living more in the moment, for example, or you're listening more to your immediate desires rather than to a productive end and stuff like that. But it's a little bit of a different world that you're opening. The part that is the remnant. Or, of course, if you think about the idea of like, I don't want to use preaching words, but like a society that is generally given to evil, and then a remnant in there that is still in touch with goodness. That's the remnant that's still in touch with goodness can kind of seed a new overall order of things, or can, yeah. Although I don't really, because there is this archetype of kind of, at least in the flood or stuff like that, like, destroy everything except for this tiny bit. I don't, I think that I only see that in a very, very symbolic sense. Obviously, like, it's not my idea of praxis that you want to just level everything. And indeed, even the way that story goes, it's like, this is not happening again. We're not leveling everything and just taking a small bit. But there is still that same principle of like certain elements being structured by one pattern, and then certain elements are attuned to a different pattern, which of course from the inside, from the point of view of the structure, it looks like the remnant elements are in utter chaos, but it's not. It's like a different kind of order. Or maybe you could look at it that it is chaos that the remnant is attuned to. If you look at it, if you go up to the most fundamental and basic, the most fundamental and like foundational, which I think literally means the same thing, etymologically, but kind of instance of this, then you're talking about Georges Bataille. Then you're talking about what he talks about in his exposition of the idea of a sacred remnant or margin, where he's talking about, the entire world basically of work and of instruments that do something else and that sustain something else, and kind of the societal agreements and that we live by, and all of that whole structure, and even like the good working order of your body and what you need to do to sustain that and to store up things so you'll have more, and and the good working order of relationships between people where there's mutual respect and just everything basically ordered. And then, what's outside of that and what remains from that, and this kind of antithesis, kind of like balancing principle of that, if things are arranged rightly, it'll still be present, um, is the realm of eroticism and is the realm of death, speaking taken very broadly. To me, that also connects to the realm of like beauty and of pleasure. And there is this idea of like, yeah, ornamentation because of excess, all of those things have to do with excess. Pleasure for pleasure's sake, beauty, ornamentation, um, and because it's something that's on top of, what's strictly needed or what's instrumental. Like you have things that are practical, and then you have things that are in excess of that. But the beautiful thing about those excess, and I'll get to death in a second, but about those those excess elements or excess experiences is that they're the only things that exist for themselves. Because the way that the world works, the way that this structure of the world works, is that it's made of instruments. It's made by instrumentation. You put your time, not to spend for itself, but primarily, I'll work, I'll, plant crops so that I can harvest them later. I will raise my child every day so that my child can grow up and be, a full human. I will, I have this spoon so that I can eat with it. Those are the kind of objects that exist within the framework, and I'm thinking of it kind of like a net that like takes that isolates, like a net that's filtered through a field. Okay, I won't try to describe my mental images, but for 3D projections of my thoughts, my life would be so much easier. I could probably connect that back to what we're talking about right now if I went on a tangent, but I don't think I should. I feel like I'm already losing it. Where were we? The way that things work in the structure is by instrumentation, and then the stuff that's outside of it, sacred remnant. Of course, this isn't necessarily true for all instances of what I'm talking about, because right now I'm talking about almost like a very, very, or the most fundamental instance of this, so it's in extremes and in extreme terms. And things are fractal, so like there's all kinds of incidents of this, and obviously nothing even ever manifests. This is talking about the principle of the thing. When you see it manifested in real life, it's not going to be literally, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be exact manifestation of that principle. Just like if you have a spherical object, it is not the Platonic ideal of a sphere exactly. There's a little bit of friction, there's a little bit of static, because it's being brought into the physical world. So of course it's not perfectly spherical, and it's made of little particles and different things. So as soon as you actually manifest a pattern, you're then ceasing to deal with the pattern in its perfection. There's like, and that is another, and that the way by which things manifest is another instance of the remnant and structure. The structure being the pattern, I guess, of it, and the remnant being that with the friction that results from it being physical, because unity and multiplicity, matter is inherently you're dealing with multiplicity, with all these little vectors, with all these separate, yeah. So like I often think about the body and the physicality of things being in the place of the remnant, the imperfection of things. Having that sacredness to it. But it's all the reverse is kind of also true, where you have the physical, pragmatic, world of matter makes up the structure of our lives and upholds us, and then more spiritual experiences of transcendence are on the outside and the remnant of that. But it is both. And that adds a wrench in thing. Well, it doesn't add a wrench, but it just adds complexity. Because I think you could look at it both ways. Matter, broadly speaking, as being the structure, and spirit being the remnant, or spirit, broadly speaking, being the structure, and matter being the remnant. And of course, there is no pure instance of matter, and there's no pure instance of spirit. There's always an admixture. And so, yeah, it's fractals all the way down. So, but Bataille is talking about, I don't think he's really talking in terms of matter and spirit as much. I guess he's talking in terms of matter as the structure and spirit. No, because he's talking about eroticism, and physical. Well, see, there's that. That is the and he actually talks about this, but that's the kind of paradox, or a kind of paradox in it, structuring paradox in it, is that which opens us. Okay, let me just backtrack. I'm mostly talking to myself here because I'm just trying to observe how my mind works and figure out if there's any kind of coherence in it at all, because it feels like there is, but I'm like, how would I even lay this out? Because I'm jumping all over the map. But I must be trying to get somewhere because the thoughts do come into my head. Whatever, I'm mostly talking to myself, but I'm trying to at least draw some sort of overall picture. So Bataille, he's talking again about the structures that underlay and that create our society, and the structure of our workaday society. And then he's talking about things and experiences that are outside of that, and those are sacred, and that's the sacred remnant, and that's the erotic, and yeah. But interestingly enough, and if you look at it in terms of matter and spirit, or body and spirit, there's kind of this X shaped. There's this inverse relationship, because so erotic, or remnant, marginal experiences would be something like, there's a lot of examples, but obviously the primary one that he's working with is that of eroticism and sex, where the individuals disappear and become, lost in the other, and the boundaries very much dissolve. And that is kind of a spiritual, transcendent experience, because you're kind of opened up, out of all of your borders are dissolved, and that's kind of the realm that's the nature of the spiritual and the transcendent. But it's also obviously the gateway to that is through the flesh, very much so. And so there is that kind of, or even I don't know, listening to music and having a bit of a transcendent experience, where you're not thinking in terms of linear time, and you're not thinking in terms of how you're going to use this productively, and you're not thinking in terms of all these things that structure our world and that let us exist in the world in the first place. You're jumping off from that and just having an experience. But the gateway to that is also through the body. And that was another connection that I made, was between the idea of wound and gateway, and because the remnant, the margin, and the sacred is kind of a wound in structure. It's an imperfection in it. It is that which exceeds structure and that which breaks structure down, and that place where structure breaks down. That's what the remnant is. You're at work and you're living your normal life, and someone you love dies, and you can't. It breaks. Things break down. Or you like have a kid or something, and this new life is coming to the world, and that's a disruptive experience. And so, yeah, it serves both as, and we feel, and there's a pain to it. And this is also where it gets into death, because there's a pain to it, because we exist between these two. We contain both of these. And we exist between these two, kind of, order and chaos. If you want to look at structure, order, and the remnant is the chaos that remains. We exist between those two. So, if my day-to-day structure gets interrupted, then that's it. It hurts me. Well, and you don't notice that as much with some instances. Like, if it's time for you to go on a vacation, you go on a vacation, you feel a lot better. But with other instances of this, it's clearer. Like if you fall in love or you have an intense erotic experience, it, shakes up your sense of self. And there's a tremendous vulnerability in that. And that's kind of where we get into why these ideas of festival, excess, enjoyment, pleasure, or just intense experience, margins, remnant, beauty, and kind of celebration, and kind of, instead of storing up, you spend it all. Instead of using something as an instrument to further another end in order, to literally maintain the world, very necessary, we splurge and don't even think about that and just let loose. That's why, those experiences, which seem like the opposite of death, so you have another bit of an inverse relationship, but those experiences seem like the opposite of death, but they are symbolically connected to death. Because what is death? At least death as defined by me and George Bataille also. What is death? It is the breaking down fully and finally. The finitude, the breaking down of boundaries. I mean, your body is not held together anymore. It melts into a wider unity. The wider unity of the planet and of the universe. And if you kind of look at the universe as metaphysical and unity with a capital U, you kind of go back into that kind of thing. And these experiences, and so all of life is a kind of a fall, or you could look at it as a rising too, but it's a fall from unity, capital U, down into multiplicity, and into matter, therefore, and into linear time, and into the ability of things to be separate, and then the ability of things to produce other things, and therefore things to be in relation, and things to be instrumental, and produce other things, support other things. And it's that, it's also emanation, but let's not get into that. It's that kind of descent, which is scendere in Italian, and that's one of the most beautiful Italian words to me. But, so therefore the kind of structure that it's falling down and crystallizing into is that structure of holding things together, which also kind of implies holding them separately. Because if you just have a jumble of stuff, it's not really, it's uniform, it's one thing. So holding things in relation, I guess you would say, is what structure that crystallizes out. And that structure depends upon the boundaries being maintained. If you go into work, you know, let me try and think of a practical example for this. Well, I mean, obviously, if you're gonna, oh, well, obviously the world depends on the boundaries being maintained. I don't know. If you're drinking water, with a cup in order to keep your body at the right amount of water, in order to keep the right homeostasis and the composition of your body so your body doesn't dissolve and like shrivel away. The cup also has to hold the water. It can't melt and be. It's dependent upon structure and order. And therefore denying and saying no to some things. Because then this is something that comes from gestalt psychology, but every thing that exists and also every kind of statement or every definition you make, there's highlighting and a hiding. So this manifestation of the world and also of kind of societies depends upon this movement of highlighting and hiding. You're highlighting because everything. So first of all, every definition depends on highlighting and hiding. And the example that I usually use is, well, this is a climbing shoe. So it's a climbing shoe. It's being a climbing shoe right now and it's defined as a climbing shoe. However, if I say this is a climbing shoe, and if it exists as a climbing shoe, that's what's highlighted or what's affirmed. Then there's also aspects of it that are being denied. For instance, I could use it as a weapon to hit somebody. I could melt down the rubber and make something else. I could, as the adage goes, boil and eat like the leather if I was starving or something. But then it would not be highlighted as a climbing shoe anymore. It wouldn't be a climbing shoe. It wouldn't be being a climbing shoe anymore. It would be being something else. So you see there's that idea of highlighting and hiding. Anything that comes into existence, because you're going away from unity or whatever, you're coming into specificity, that implies an A and a B, a thesis and an antithesis, highlighting and hiding. So this movement into form, into the world, and into society, it highlights the separateness of things and then their harmonious relation in order to create structures, upholding structures. So it highlights that I exist in my body apart from my parents and the people around me. And also it highlights that when I want something, I politely ask for it. I don't just go grab it. When I feel angry, I don't just kill someone because that would. But you see that there is in all of these this paradox because, as I said, it highlights the togetherness of things, but that also means that it highlights them being separate in the first place. But that's the movement, I guess, of manifestation, or kind of life. Well, I wouldn't say it's of life, because life includes a lot of things, but it's the movement of, let's say, the sustaining of things. Is, highlighting the separateness and the good order of them. But what are we hiding in all of that? Is, of course, broadly speaking, chaos. And the underlying fact that, all is one on the most fundamental level. In order for things to exist as they do in a world, we need to hide that. That needs to not be there. But it's still there. And, it doesn't cease to exist. Eventually, if society crumbled and humans went away, this would essentially cease to be a climbing shoe because nobody would know what is a climbing shoe. If, given enough time, it would decay and therefore also cease to be that. A human being or any entity is eventually going to die, and that means that you kind of reverse this movement and it comes back up. and those boundaries and those highlighting and hiding. What was hidden, excuse me, opens up. And of course, you've only hidden it, you haven't made it cease to exist. Well, obviously, we all know this, everything comes to an end and everything dies. Just because you can't be constantly thinking about that and living your daily life doesn't mean that it isn't true. And the appropriate thing to do is to have exactly a remnant, a margin, a space for those things, a little imperfection in the stitches, a little side wound summer, except it's side wound fall now. And in order to allow space for that, to let it in a little bit so that it won't get suppressed and suppressed and suppressed and bottled up and completely swamp you. So chaos, there has to be space for it a little bit. Because that's simply the nature of things. I mean, that is the fact, is that you can't get rid of chaos. Even though you do need to again, hide it behind the highlight, you need to kind of suppress it in order for anything to exist in the first place. And experiences that are these little gateways, little spaces, because again, you don't want to let it swamp you, because that would destroy everything, would be out of balance. But obviously, if let's see, what happens if you try to just have the highlight in hiding and you try to keep that in stasis? Well, everything's destroyed on both sides of the equation. It all falls. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I mean, because obviously there's intuitively, if you suppress something for too long, the pressure will build up and then it'll burst out if you let it out gradually. Then it can be remained in a peaceful relationship. But a society that forces everyone to consider themselves as only instruments and consider themselves only as how they can contribute to the structure and to the maintenance of things, well, people will be miserable, either they'll die off or they'll revolt, the human soul shrivels, etc., etc. Everyone knows how bad that is because we're living in it or whatever. But yeah, so that's why you would have, say, Sabbath. It is as, or why you'd have vacation, or why you would have hobbies, or why you would have sleep, even symbolically. It's a kind of nod to this up here that's in the unity and the chaos. And so oh my god, I was going to say something about, yeah, so that's why experiences that can be that gateway and that can be that little pressure valve and escape include, memento mori stuff, but also include beauty and pleasure and just anything that doesn't fit into the instrumental, material, practical world. And morality belongs to the structured world, or belongs to the world, you might say. The sacred remnant is outside of that, I mean, by definition, or transcends that. And so, an experience like festival or you know, falling deeply, deeply in love or loving something and to being completely indistinguishable. And experiences like that, they aren't. They take you outside yourself, they take you outside of the ordinary realm of things. And in order to have the power that they have, and why they have the power that they have, is because you can't put them in a box and you can't categorize them. And that means that it's just about experiencing them. And in experiencing them, there is a fear and a kind of terror sometimes existentially, and a threatening of all of the neat, orderly boxes of your world. But you know what? That's all going to be threatened eventually too. Nobody escapes death. Um, you can't just ignore it all the time, or if you do ignore it all the time, it still exists outside of you, and it will come in and sweep you away. So, as the Orthodox say, if you die before you die, then when you die, you will not die. It's about kind of um, letting it in little ways, and that makes it easier to live in harmony with the ungraspable greater unity that sustains life, but also that eventually destroys all order in order to reintegrate it. But yeah, that's what happens in my brain in the span of about 2 minutes when I think about remainders in algebra or pre-algebra for too long. So you can see why I'm struggling so much with math.